Back in the day, before streaming, before CDs, we listened to music on albums. A vinyl disc spinning 33 and a third revolutions per minute brought us great music one side at a time. 20 or so minutes of music, 4 or 5 songs usually, that created a single listening experience. This format exposed us to other songs of the artist, not just the hits, and often flowed in an order that was created to build and maintain or mold a musical experience for the listener.
Sideshow brings musical experiences from the past to life today. Here, we discuss and review individual sides of record albums we have grown to appreciate and hope you will too. Welcome to The Sideshow.
So Mike, what are you going to bring to the table today?
Well, the side that I'm bringing is side 2 from Pink Floyd's Meddle album from 1971. And side 2 of Meddle has a single track. It's 23 and a half minutes long, called Echoes. Pink Floyd is one of our favorite bands. Mark and I have been listening to Pink Floyd going back to junior high school with Dark Side of the Moon. In high school, we started to delve a little deeper into the band's all of their more of their recordings, and the Meddle album, in my judgment, is where the early Pink Floyd, where they really took a while to kind of figure out what they were going to be in the long haul, and Meddle is the album where it really all kind of came together. One of the, and afterwards, they became one of the biggest bands in the world and stayed that way for a long time, and would be regarded by most people as being one of the major bands from the classic rock era. But when they started, the Pink Floyd originally formed in 1965 in England. Most of the members were from Cambridge, England, and the unequivocal leader of the band at that time was named Roger Barrett, better known as Syd Barrett. And Syd Barrett, it would take multiple podcasts to be able to truly encapsulate just Syd Barrett and his role in the band and in music and in mid-60s London. But he was a unique character. He was a combination, whimsically poetic minstrel and sort of zonked madcap with a loud electric guitar. And when the band first started playing out, after 1965, 1966, they'd play covers of R&B and blues songs, and then they'd throw these psychotic improvisational jams in the middle, kind of like, not unlike Psychotic Reaction, the garage band song from the mid 60s. And they kind of were the English equivalent, where they played and who they were playing with, not unlike bands like Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead were doing in the United States and San Francisco. Pink Floyd was doing similar type things in London in the mid 60s, and their first album, which was released in 1967, was dominated by Syd Barrett's influence, and it was unlike anything that they did after that. Before that first album, called Piper at the Gates of Dawn, was released in 1967, they'd had some big singles that were again part of swinging London in that era, leading up to the Summer of Love in 1967, and for a number of reasons, Syd Barrett was destined to not stay in the band. And as I said, that's a long, fairly involved story that is beyond the scope of today's podcast. But in any event, it was an album that is historical and is unique and is regarded by critics as probably one of the more groundbreaking creations of the band. But Syd Barrett ended up leaving the band, not entirely voluntarily, after that record. And guitarist David Gilmour, who remained with Pink Floyd from that point onward, was brought in to play guitar, which had been Syd Barrett's instrument. He was the sole guitarist before Gilmour came on. But their second album is called Saucerful of Secrets. Syd Barrett was still involved, but it was on his way out. There was one of his songs on the album. But the kind of part of the template of the rest of the band's history did start to come into focus at that time. And given Roger Waters, the bassist, and Nick Mason, the drummer's participation in architecture school, it kind of began the architectural structuring of pieces of music. And at least two of the songs on Saucerful of Secrets, the title track and also Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, sort of laid out this ethereal mood music. There were vocals and lyrics in Set the Controls, but no lyrics at all for Saucerful of Secrets. And they sort of created this kind of space rock for stoners. And those two tracks remained in their repertoire through the mid-'70s, until after they'd become a big international popular band because of Dark Side of the Moon. So they did put down some of their roots with that album, but it was a relatively narrow lane that they were operating in at that point. But they started to establish themselves as a unique live act at that time, not unlike some of the San Francisco bands might have as they kind of moved beyond the Summer of Love type era. But the next album was a soundtrack album for a film. It was titled More, which was the name of the film, and it was much different than either of the first two albums. And the opening track called Cirrus Minor had that ethereal organ sound, but a lot of the other material was just kind of background music, instrumental, not appropriate for a movie, but not really songs. There were songs like the Nile song, which was basically like a power trio, almost Led Zeppelin style hard rock, which unlike most all of the rest of their output, there were a couple of songs on that album like Cymbeline and Green is the Color that stayed in their live repertoire for several years after that. But because it was a soundtrack, and because they did some songs that weren't really representative of their predominant style of music, as an album that there really wasn't a lot to it, in my opinion. There's some pleasant stuff on it. But as an album, it didn't really move them that much forward. After that, the next album was called Umaguma. It was a double album. The first album was a live album, and it was a little on the short side, but it was a good live album as those things go. And if they'd taken other material from the same time period and turn into, say, a double live album, it probably would have been a cool live album. As it was pretty good, but nothing groundbreaking. Just live renditions of established material, and good versions, including Saucerful of Secrets and Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun. And also Careful with That Axe, Eugene, which was a major part of their live shows around that from the late 60s to the early 70s. The other album, it was a double album. The other album was a studio album, but was comprised of solo creations by each of the four band members. And Roger Waters wrote a song called Grantchester Meadows, which is a pretty good acoustic number. But also had a track called Several Species of Small Furry Animals Gathered in a Cave and Grooving with a Pict. is a paraphrase of the title of the song, and it's basically a novelty track. I mean, it's kind of interesting and very sonically unique, but it was the sort of thing you'd play for your stoner friends, more so than a real song. And David Gilmour did a track called "The Narrow Way," which had some good parts. The opening of the song is acoustic guitar with some synthesizer effects. It's kind of cool, kind of light, but still kind of intriguing. And the rest of that, the stuff from Nick Mason and Richard Wright, the drummer and keyboard player, were just pretty forgettable. So while it was an interesting album, it didn't really move them forward in any serious way as a band. Their next album was Atom Heart Mother, and Atom Heart Mother bears some similarities to Meddle. It has a side-long track and then individual songs on the other side, but the individual songs were pretty forgettable. Whereas on Meddle, on side one, the individual songs there was some fairly compelling stuff. The side long track of Atom Heart Mother, which was called Atom Heart Mother, was interesting, but they used it was sort of orchestral. They had a horn section and choir, vocals. It was kind of quasi-classical. And while it was probably interesting and perhaps thought to be innovative at the time, listening to it now, it's just not that good, really. And just it sort of maybe set a template for something to do, and well, it did do that because that's kind of what they did on Meddle to better effect. But it was a number one in the UK in 1970. So Atom Heart Mother was big, and the band toured behind it extensively in both Europe and the United States. And a lot of video from that era is available on the Pink Floyd Early Years box set, which covers a lot of material from the formation of the band through right before Dark Side of the Moon came out. And after Atom Heart Mother, Pink Floyd was sort of kind of floundering around for a style, or for what are we going to do? And because basically they were at a point where that nothing they'd done had really satisfied them. And Meddle, and particularly Echoes, the side long track on side two of Meddle, is where and a lot of people, this wasn't something that I came up with, but a lot of people look at that as where the band really put everything together. Pink Floyd was known for their artwork, starting with the second album. A man named Storm Thorgerson, who ran a company called Hypnosis, had done the artwork for their albums, and he did the artwork for Meddle. As it so happened, Pink Floyd was touring in the Far East at the time that in the latter part of 1971 when the album came out, and so they were like doing it by phone as to what the album cover would be, and there was some disagreement initially between the Hypnosis people and the band members, and they ended up agreeing on what is actually a very appropriate image given the lyrics of Echoes. It's a very bluish. I don't have a copy of the album with me right now, but it's a sort of an aquatic blue color, and you can see the shape of an ear if you look carefully. But it's beneath some water, and there's some concentric circle ripples over the ear, which suggests sort of a subaquatic audio scenario, which, as I say, works well with the lyrics of Echoes. But Mark, what are your thoughts about Pink Floyd Meddle?
Well, I think first of all, I think that was a good kind of summary of what they'd done and moved through in the way of albums coming up to Meddle. One of the things, looking at the album work of a band like Pink Floyd, I mean, you look at a band like the Beatles. We have to record an album. They would go into the studio, they'd have 10 songs, 12 songs, they would record those 10 songs, 12 songs, and then they were done. They'd move on, and they'd either tour, or they'd say, okay, well, now we have to make another album. And they'd come up with 10, 12 songs, they'd put it on that album. It was one, then the next, then the next. Very common formula that was driven a lot by the record companies themselves, right? You move these, and every now and then you'd have a song that didn't get used on this album, so it would pop up later on a later album. But they were kind of separate, distinct, time periods that reflected on a single album. In Floyd, you see this idea that there's, especially if you listen to some of their live work, where they're playing or experimenting with a sound that, if you know and understand, a lot of the music, you say, okay, well, that was really the basis for a song that showed up 2 albums later, right? They seem to experiment with, especially in their live performances, with stuff that would linger and themes that you might not even come up with again until later. In fact, after they had broken up, they released some CDs of just some stuff that never really came together in material at all, into songs, just these different themes. So the notion of like different types of music flowing together, as opposed to just, this is a song and these 5 songs will come together to form this album, was really not apparently the way that they worked. Or the way that they thought. And I felt that, especially when it came up to, by the time they'd gotten to the album Meddle, and specifically the song Echoes, reflected in the fact that they were able to make something that lasted for, 20 minutes of time, yet it wasn't, let's do this for 5 minutes, and then let's do this for 3 minutes, and then let's do this. It really seemed to flow. That ability to weave together the different music that they were dealing with was very obvious on their early albums, and it also in their later albums, when they moved much more to more of a concept type albums where the music could flow from one to the end, retaining a concept like that. And Meddle really was that turning point. You could sense a floundering in the earlier albums. And I don't mean floundering like they weren't doing well, but they were floundering for a real kind of sense of the type of band that they wanted to be and the type of music that they wanted to be. That was a clearly pivotal point, because after Meddle, I mean, it is just incredible success in making music and releasing albums that flowed from the what they were able to do on Meddle, and which is why I think it's a very appropriate album and side for you to dig into today.
Well, and the method that apparently was used to create what became Echoes was, they just showed up at the studio and just said, let's just start diddling around, and anything we come up with, we'll record it, and then we'll come back to it later. And apparently there were like 25 or some different bits that monkeying around. They'd come up with a riff, or they'd come up with a chord, or come up with something, and they'd put it in. And they called apparently in the studio these individual bits of music that they would come up with. They called nothings. And so they came up with like about 25 of these, and eventually Roger Waters and Nick Mason kind of took these things and sort of structured them. They framed the material not unlike an architectural draft. And then Wright's Keyboards came in and sort of added coloring. And that left David Gilmour, the guitarist, as the primary soloist, and he would, really take the colors and add depth and sort of draw the picture as to what the song was really going to become. And that's kind of a trite way of describing it, but it was kind of like that. And as they continued to use these bits of material called nothings to put them together, they'd come up with newer versions. And when they first started to play early versions of Echoes, it was called The Return of the Son of Nothing. And it came from those nothings. There's nothing, yeah. Then there's the son of nothing, and then there's the return of, kind of like the, yeah. Son of Frankenstein and whatnot.
Movie sequels.
Yeah, and another big difference between the Atom Heart Mother project is Echoes was just a band. There weren't. It could be played, drums, bass, keyboards, guitar. Now, there was some synthesizers and studio effects that were in there, but it wasn't. They didn't need to bring outside musicians in. They didn't need to bring horn players and choir singers or anything like that. It was all created by the band and was something that translated pretty well to live performance. And Roger Waters wrote the lyrics, and it was originally going to have sort of a space, sort of an astral theme. And when he talks about people meeting eventually, it was intended to be the joining of celestial bodies, and it was determined that was that was just not what he was looking for, and so the original motif, so to speak, lyrically was aquatic. And the song starts with a single note that I think originally came from a grand piano, but the studio effects make it sound kind of like an underwater sonar ping, like a ship looking for a submarine. This ping, and that's all you hear is this repeating ping. But then Wright comes in with some more kind of a building, very quiet, very calm organ pattern to start to flesh things out a little bit. And then Gilmour comes in playing stuff not unlike the very beginning of the first part of Shine On You Crazy Diamond, where it's just, this guitar is coming in, but it's not dominating, it's just coming in. Then the bass comes in, and Waters starts to kind of add a little bottom end, and then the drums. And so then suddenly the song is playing, and the lyrics start, and it's the overhead, the albatross, and it sort of starts the aquatic motif, and it's talking about deep beneath the rolling waves and labyrinths of coral caves, and everything is green and submarine. I mean, you're underwater, and the music is consistent with that, and it's slower, but it's got some heft to it, then the second set of lyrics, or the second verse is, no one showed us the land and no one knows the wheres or whys, but something stirs and something tries and starts to climb toward the light. And so you've got this imagery has created this, there's something, some life down at the bottom of the ocean, and it's coming out of its cave, and it's coming to the surface. But then the lyrics continue, and you get into the strangers passing in the street, by chance two separate glances meet, and so it's switched from life forming and coming to the surface to here we are walking the earth and we're alienated from each other, and that makes it sound a little starker contrast than it really is, because it kind of works when you listen to the song. But that was going to be alienation and people's inability to communicate with each other and whatnot is certainly something that was going to be on Roger Waters' mind in terms of the lyrics he was going to be writing in the future. And so it really is a I think a sign of why this is a turning point for Pink Floyd. And then the first set of the vocals kind of comes to an end when they sing, no one, and it's Roger Waters isn't singing, it's harmony vocals with David Gilmour and Richard Wright, but they conclude with "No one flies around the sun," and there was this repeating riff, guitar riff played by Gilmour and then sort of also by Waters at the same time, that has some oomph to it, and it leads to a David Gilmour guitar solo, relatively conventional, and not unlike the sort of stuff you'd hear on Wish You Were Here, like Shine On You Crazy Diamond, but with the whole band is into it. And it's sort of the first time you really hear the sort of modern David Gilmour effects-laden, sustained notes lead guitar solo. Although not as spectacular as some of his later ones, but the it kind of the song then the singing is done for the time being, and it segues into sort of this Floyd funky syncopation, not unlike what you'd hear later in songs like Money or Have a Cigar. Sort of like, middle class English boys try to play funk kind of thing. But it was cool. It sounded like Pink Floyd, and there were these dueling organ riffs over this kind of funky drum and bass, these drum and bass lines that were being played, and Gilmour started playing these leads with this really rich effect that he kind of became known for, and I've learned from a musician friend of mine that the effect was brought with what's called a Binson echo rec, ECHOREC, and it sort of gives it this dripping, this is the sound of your brain on drugs kind of effect to Gilmour's guitar playing, and it's one of the cooler parts of the song. It's instrumental, and it's spacey, but it's four musicians playing off of each other, and the sort of thing that would have been really cool to have seen live, I think. And there's actually a very good version of Echoes on the Pink Floyd Live at Pompeii, which is available on DVD, and it's kind of the high point of Pink Floyd, in my opinion, prior to Dark Side of the Moon. But in any case, that sort of funky jam kind of fades into this really kind of otherworldly sort of mist marsh, fire swamp ambiance, and there's either a heavy effect guitar or synthesizer sounds of whatever inhabitant creatures there are in this world that's being painted with the sound, and you can hear in the background eventually, behind this sort of synthesizer type strange sounds, it sounds like geese or ducks. I mean, some sort of migratory waterfowl quacking in this wherever it is you are, while that the sound is trying to create, and it's kind of weird. This isn't the sort of music that you put on just any time. And truth be told, back in the day, if I was going to put Meddle on, hang around with people, 4 times out of 5, I'd put on side 1 instead of side 2, because it had to be the right circumstance to really sit and listen to Echoes, and especially because of that sort of the weirdness of that part. But it's compelling, in my opinion, and was the sort of thing that was going to crop up later on, say like the middle section of Dogs on Pink Floyd Animals. It's not unlike that. Mm-hmm. But eventually the submarine ping kind of returns, sort of to guide the listener home. And it's like, okay, you've been holding your breath too long. It's time to come up. And then the four instrumentalists kind of start to come back together. The drums, the bass, the keyboard, and the guitar start to come back together, and they start building towards the climax of that section. And it really ends with a great segue back into the lyrical part of the song from before this relatively lengthy break with the funky jam and the what I call the middle section. And it with the submarine ping and everything, it's almost like you're surfacing from having been underwater, but the lyrical content of that part of the song where you fall upon my waking eyes, inviting and inciting me to rise. It's in addition to the musical imagery of surfacing from being underwater. It sort of also alludes to waking from a dream, and then it kind of drifts back, and the lyrics continue in that vein, and then there's kind of a guitar climax, which when they play it live is pretty intense, pretty rockin' almost. But then it ultimately segues into a kind of a very calming closing section with the same sort of organ that the song started with, and then a rising sound, which to me sounds kind of like evaporation, and which is consistent with the aquatic, motif that starts out the song, and then it comes to an end, and it's the sort of thing that kind of leaves you thinking, and if you sit down and you listen to the side as a whole, it's the sort of thing where you sit there for a few minutes and think about what you just heard, and for that reason, I find it, even though it's a single track, 23 and a half minutes long, it's one of the better vinyl sides, in my humble opinion. What do you think?
I'd really have to agree, and one of the things about it, there's a number of bands put out, side length songs. Some of them very good, some of them not so good, but a lot of them you can really break them down into distinct songs, not distinct sections, but distinct songs that they just basically pushed together, and they did some form of transition from one to the next, and it doesn't work as well as Echoes does. When you're listening to Echoes, and you talked about the earlier Pink Floyd being stoner music, there's the song Echoes had some appeal to stoners back in the day, especially laying with the headphones on, in your bedroom at the end of the night and that type of thing. But any listening to it where you're really just sitting and listening and focusing on the music, these sections are very different, but you really do feel taken from one part of the song to the next. You talked about the early part of the song where we've got this underwater sensation that and lyrical part that moves into this jazz funk. You feel like, where is this taking me now? That's the sense that's going through your mind as you're moving from one section to the next, and that funky part moves into this what I'll call a scarier middle section, and literally thinking, where are we going now? Because it's not one part stops and the next part starts. They do a very good job of bringing you into each of these sections, which is why this particular very lengthy song really does feel more like a single song than what you'll sometimes hear is, this is kind of a bunch of different songs that were just put together, 3 or 4 different musical experiences that they put together in a single song. So it takes you through a number of different emotions and feelings, and does wrap you back around in the beginning to a feeling that was very similar to when it started. And I think some wonderful lyrics that bring up thoughts of the sun coming up in the morning, and the ambassadors of morning coming through the window in the wall. It just really interesting lyrics that kind of rest you down at the end, like they brought you out of this place and then set you back down. To your point, be in a position where you want to just kind of think about it for a minute, about everything that you went through. So I share your enthusiasm and like of this particular song and this particular side.
Well, and on side one, two of the songs, One of These Days and Fearless, are regarded as some of Pink Floyd's better offerings, pre Dark Side of the Moon. And the song Pillow of Winds is a very pleasant acoustic song. The last two songs on side one, Saint Tropez and Seamus, and people that are familiar with Pink Floyd will know well about those songs, but they're just not up to the standard, and they're just not up to the standard. Yeah. And there's and that's not to say that, not stylistically, like quality.
Yeah.
It's an important album, in my opinion, in the evolution of Pink Floyd, and I think that the key to that is Echoes. And in between Meddle and Dark Side of the Moon, Pink Floyd recorded another soundtrack album, which I believe called Obscured by Clouds, which I believe is vastly superior to more their earlier soundtrack, because it had more conventional songs and the songs were better. It wasn't representative of Pink Floyd for the most part. There were some, the instrumental Obscured by Clouds, and then the second track, which I can't remember the title of off the top of my head, another instrumental. Those were more representative of Pink Floyd. But I've read at least one music critic that said that on Echoes, they really did a better job of achieving a cinematic mood than on any of their actual soundtrack albums. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true. And it's almost like, it's not just like having a pop song on in the background or any kind of song on in the background. It's almost like having mood music, but that you've got to pay attention to, mm-hmm. if you're really going to get your money's worth out of the experience, which is sort of what they were looking for with their later albums. Their concept albums, Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals, and The Wall. And so they it really kind of set the table for what they were going to do later. And those four albums, all four of them achieved massive success. Dark Side of the Moon in particular, and The Wall. But anyone who is even latently interested in Pink Floyd should check it out.
Yes, I would wholeheartedly agree. And it's interesting with Pink Floyd. I really am glad that you took the time to go through some of what led up to them recording that album, because, again, unlike a lot of bands, it's hard to separate some of Pink Floyd's earlier days and what they went through in a lot of their psychedelical experimentation in their live shows, with the soundtrack work that they did, and even their band members. You cannot separate Syd Barrett from Pink Floyd. In fact, it really came up in Wish You Were Here as a big theme of the album. You just don't get a sense like that with someone like Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones, which is obviously a very important and significant loss to the band and the members of the band. But you don't see the band so closely tied to those early events as you do with a situation like Syd Barrett and Pink Floyd. So very interesting and important to bring that up. But the bottom line, a great song to sit down in in a quiet room, if you can put the headphones on, just listen to it from start to finish, and really try to hear what's coming in there. An amazing experience.
The and and you're absolutely right about the fact that Pink Floyd was never really able to get out from under the shadow of Syd Barrett, and not to delve too deeply into it, but I mean Syd Barrett sort of flamed out in part because of excessive drug use, LSD use, and probably there was some underlying mental illness there that may not have manifested itself in the way that it did if Barrett had not been so excessive in his drug use. But David Gilmour, who knew, and Roger Waters knew Syd Barrett from Cambridge, and so they were like childhood friends. They knew each other, and their opinion is that the drugs was probably more of a catalyst than something that created it. But in any event, the bottom line was he was the English equivalent of being protectively placed. I mean, he lived with his mother, and he was mentally ill. And his condition was managed to the point where he could live happily. But I mean, his days of being part of the real world ended, when he left Pink Floyd. And the Dark Side of the Moon, I mean, is clearly an album about people being driven to madness. That's what it's about. And Wish You Were Here is obviously, that was dedicated to his memory. The song Shine On You Crazy Diamond is explicitly about Syd Barrett. And but they were able to do something with that was vastly different from the sort of music that Syd Barrett created, and put it into the context of the real world. And what happened to Syd Barrett ultimately after he left the band was he hid in his shell, and he just
Yes.
he voluntarily he was more the real world was just not what he was interested in, and being just living in his own mind with his own thoughts was preferable to him.
Exactly.
Whether that was voluntary or not, that's the way it was. So, in any case, Pink Floyd Meddle, Side 2.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike.